Okay, and then I'm gonna start the timer as soon as. Okay. Ready?
Mm-hmm.
And go. The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything.
Said Albert Einstein. Hi, my name is Gabby Mountjoy.
I'm Nono Sugawara.
And I'm Lisa Kim.
With recent radical terrorist attacks, such as the November Paris attacks, the significance of terrorism has escalated. Terrorism, according to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, is life-threatening acts aimed to intimidate or coerce a civilian population. Now, the question arises, how do we stop terrorism? What future methods can be implicated from looking at its effects on national security? In order to answer this question, first we need to understand the psychology of terrorists.
The general public has a very shallow understanding of who terrorists actually are, despite the extraordinary amount of coverage they receive on social media and news platforms. One of these misconceptions people have of terrorists is that they are either a psychopath or otherwise mentally ill, as stated by Professor Andrew Silk, Director of Terrorism Studies. Ted Kaczynski, who is depicted here, was one of these confirmed schizophrenic terrorists who threatened the United States in the 1980s and late 1990s. However, as Jason Spinelletta, an expert in human factors, an expert in psychology, states, such terrorists have difficulty cooperating with others, forcing them to become lone wolf terrorists, and only make up the minority of terrorists who affect our world today. Psychology Today, a leading organization in psychological topics, argues that terrorists tend to be stable individuals, not paranoid or delusional. Instead, Jeff Victoroff, a professor in neurology and psychiatry, states that terrorists either show
an extroverted stimulus-seeking dependent pattern or a hostile, suspicious, defensive pattern,
making them more vulnerable to the ideologies of radical terrorism. In addition, many current terrorists are teenagers, as depicted here, experiencing vulnerabilities and craving a sense of identity and a feeling of belonging as they mature. This vulnerability, combined with a certain type of attitude as mentioned previously, can result in a person more susceptible to becoming influenced by the call of terrorism. Martha Crenshaw, an expert in terrorism studies, states a need for identity can result in
identification with a cause or membership in a group,
an attraction to the idea of belonging to a group,
rather than to an abstract ideology or violence.
Although there are exceptions, the majority of terrorists are not mentally ill and are lost individuals who yearn to belong in a group so as to form a sense of personal identity. Terrorists also vindicate their criminal actions through a psychological phenomenon of conformity, which only exists in group functions. Conformity is defined by Sean McCloy, PhD in psychology as
a social influence involving a change in belief or behavior in order to fit in with a group,
predominant in terrorist organizations. Also, a U.S. training and doctrine document states that terrorist groups believe their actions are justified due to their heavy dedication towards a single ideological cause, whether it be religion, race, or some other political view. An example of this in current day terms would be that of the extremist Muslim organization, ISIS. Terrorists become who they are from exhibiting certain behavioral patterns combined with mental vulnerabilities and vindicate their actions through conformity and dedication towards their supporting ideology. So how does this affect international relations?
Terrorism poses an undeniable threat to society. The fear created by this threat begs governments to take action to eliminate it. But is military counterterrorism effective? The answer is no, because in the end, it worsens the problem. Military intervention doesn't work because often governments form allies and try to coordinate in their support, but fail. Firstly, when they work together, it doesn't work. As of November 2015 Paris attacks, a UN security resolution was unanimously passed which planned to redouble world efforts against the Islamic State terrorist organization, essentially unifying countries against all jihadist terrorism. However, there is no proof that this will actually work because countries already have their own plan. The South China Morning Post wrote,
because Al-Qaeda in Russia has its own strategy, Britain is focused in Iraq and Canada is withdrawing. No country has deployed ground troops, nor if they did, would they be of much use without common objective and goals.
The UN resolution, in fact, says nothing about deploying ground troops or even creating common objectives. This inability to coordinate will be elaborated upon later by Lisa. So when international efforts fail, countries have the opportunities to take on radical terrorist groups on their own. This doesn't work either. According to Jack Goldsmith, professor of law at Harvard, Obama will not be ending the forever war anytime soon. Quoting a speech by Stephen Preston, the General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Defense, saying,
Because Al-Qaeda and associated forces continue to target U.S. persons and interests actively, the United States will use military force against them as necessary.
targeting U.S. interests is all too vague a term, meaning that I had another slide for this. Okay, whatever. Meaning this is all too vague a term, meaning that U.S. can basically go to war with anyone who threatens not only its security but also its economy or cultural values. When terrorist organizations spring up within a country and the government is weak, often Western countries like the U.S. find it all too easy to bring in their military to protect their own interests, which is usually oil or democracy. Once a war is started, it's harder to stop, and countries have little reason to then go in and break up the conflict unless it directly concerns them. So these weakened states are hosting the conflict and have no choice and to wait until they're once again sovereign. When working as a team or on their own, military intervention to prevent terrorism hasn't worked so far and will not work in the future. But what will?
So what can we do to prevent these radical terrorist attacks? When future terrorists look for their refuge, social media is their place to go. And the reason behind this is explained by Pamela Rutledge, a director of the Media Psychology Research Center. Rutledge states, while
Terrorist actions are meant to be overt demonstrations of the perpetrator's power and purpose, they are attempts to demoralize an enemy through fear.
and that social networks serve as a perfect media for capturing and sharing these emotions. And through this, as Frank J. Salufo, a director at Center for Cyber and Homeland Security, writes, the internet has become the leading cause for the growth of homegrown radicalization through facilitating tradecraft, online training, recruiting, and radicalizing terrorist candidates, and conducting cyber terrorism. Once again, how do we stop this? Logically, government restrictions on social media and strict online surveillances of possible terrorist users would be the correct and the most effective way to pacify internet terrorism. However, Gabriel Wayman, a professor of communications at Haifa University in Israel, reminds us through the United States Institute of Peace that
the internet is in many ways an almost perfect embodiment of the democratic ideals of free speech and open communication. It is a marketplace for ideas unlike any that has existed before.
So, by restricting social media in the prevention of future terrorist attacks, we would be then infringing upon the basic human rights of both the civilians and the terrorists, freedom of speech and the right to privacy. This then proves that constraints on social media, although beneficial, have clear impediments as a result of legal consequences. The next possible way of preventing terrorist attacks is through weapon control, and specifically gun control. Now, the focus is on the European Union, and most of the European Union nations have strict gun laws. However, in the corner of the continental Europe lies the Balkan states, the greenish area shown in the map. And according to the Small Arms Survey, an independent research project based in Switzerland for monitoring national and international initiatives, in this area lies estimated 3 to 6 million illegal firearms left over from the conflicts in 1990s, still in circulation. In this process of intensifying gun laws, the main problem arises. And while this issue requires all the members of the EU to participate, an article on the Telegraph quotes Jean-Charles Breyer, head of the Paris-based Center for Analysis of Terrorism, who says that the measures for solving weaponry issues
have been under discussion at the EU since 2003, but 12 years later, and still nothing.
On top of that, the EU not being able to coordinate with each other well leads to lack of information shared for law enforcement, which further on causes even more difficulties extracting usable future solutions. And because gun violence is not just an American issue, it is a worldwide issue, and European Union's disunification questions the feasibility of preventing radical terrorism through gun control. And now, after looking at the psychology of the terrorists, the effectiveness of counterterrorism, and finally examining 2 different possible ways of forestalling terrorist attacks, our team was able to come up with a final solution.
For our resolution today, we have come up with measures the world must take from 3 different angles. Prevention methods must target terrorists at the most fundamental level, the psychological level. Education must be implemented so that young individuals understand the dangers of not just terrorism, but gangs and other hostile organizations, which coerce vulnerable individuals in similar ways. And as for mentally ill terrorists, outreach programs and more readily available mental health care, if any, should be implemented in nations across the world.
These obstacles slow down effective prevention of radical terrorism and leave the world defenseless, so a new method is needed. Okay, From our research in this paper, we have found that countries staying largely staying largely isolationist and not getting involved on their own actually does better for a country than when they do get involved. In order to fix this issue, countries should only engage terrorism internationally when they have a common goal and can actually commit to taking action.
And finally, social media platform must promote awareness of the dangers of cyber terrorism and cooperate with non-governmental organizations to prohibit terrorist social network to a certain limit that does not infringe upon one's rights and freedom. Background checkups are needed, but restrictive laws should not be applied, and instead only through multiple stages of checkups should a person be ever defined as a terrorist so as to take away firearms from him or her. Terrorism is a critical problem that needs to be solved and prevented, and in order to do so, effective methods should be imposed upon but to a certain limit. From understanding the psychology of these terrorists, observing governmental initiative outcomes, and finally putting into consideration the limitations of these methods, although terrorism may not be completely solved, there are steps we can take to minimize the attacks.
Okay. Thank you. We are 54 seconds over, but I think we can fix that.
Yeah.
Just like, I think we can cut down on your ravening a little
Yeah,
bit.
definitely.
And then I think